So in this video, we're going to go through step by step on how to rig a Coke can inside Maya. Okay, so in this viewport, I already have a Coke can that is being rigged already. And if you notice the outliner, there is a structure to this rig Coke can. Okay, and also there is some new object, which is a NURBS object that contain two extra attributes that will drive the shape of the Coke can. Okay, so if I put some value on the squash attribute, right, this will do stretching and squash. Okay, so that's what we're gonna do in this video. Okay, same thing with the bend. So if I put some value, this will let you bend sideways. Okay, and I'm gonna undo. And one thing that you should notice is that whenever I click this circle, right, I should name this controller. Okay, all the objects also follow. Okay, so that's what this controller do. Okay, now before we jump in to the rigging right away, we need to understand like these few things. Okay, so first one is pivot. Okay, let's create some simple object, right? And if I rotate this object, right, you notice that this object rotates on its own axis. Okay, that's because the pivot, okay, so the pivot refers to this manipulator, right, is right on the center of the object. Okay, so if I create a new sphere, right, let's put the sphere here. By default, all the pivot or this manipulator are in the middle of the object. Okay, so whenever I rotate, it will do the same thing. Now, let's say I want to move this pivot. I need to hold D in my keyboard, and I can move this maybe to the sideway. So once the pivot is being moved, right, and I try to rotate, you notice that the behavior change. Okay, now this object rotating on its pivot axis like that, as compared to this sphere here. Okay, so this pivot is pretty important when it comes to arranging your deformer later. Okay, now if you want to have the pivot snapping to this grid, okay, so while you're holding D in your keyboard, you can click this button. Okay, so this will let you snap to the grid. Okay, so now this will be accurately snapped whenever you move the pivot. Okay, so that's snapping to grid. Okay, now if you want to put the pivot back, you can just click this button there. Okay, so that will let you center the pivot back to its object. Okay, so that's pivot. And moving on, we have parent. Now, what you saw here just now is a parent structure. Okay, so the controller being the parent, meaning that all the other child that you have here will follow whenever the parent is moving. Okay, so you may think that this structure like a folder in your Windows Explorer. So whenever the folder is moved, all the other files inside will also follow accordingly. Now, how do we do that in Maya? Well, let's create a sphere and let's create a big cube. Okay, so I have the sphere and a cube. Now let's say I want to make the cube the parent of this sphere. So this is going to be the child. Okay, all you have to do, just use your middle mouse button, click and drag, and drop it there. Okay, so whenever I click the cube now, the sphere will follow. Right, so that's parent hierarchy structure. And if you want to disconnect, I can use the same middle mouse button, click and drag it away. And now the connection is being disconnected. Okay, now, so moving on, controller. I think you know the controller already. So this 2D circle at the bottom is actually the controller. Now, when it comes to rigging, again, we always animate in the controller. Okay, so a good example is that when you have a character with the proper bone, right, the animator do not animate on the bone itself, but rather they do a keyframe or they animate using this controller. okay, because that's the correct way, and there is a technical explanation, a deep technical explanation behind that. But as for now, we'll just use the same rigging method. Okay, we use the controller to be the parent for this code can rigging. Okay, so that what controller mean. Now you can create the controller by going to NURBS primitive, right, and click circle. Okay, so this is going to be the controller. Depending on the type of rigging that you're trying to make, right, some will try to be modeled accordingly. So let's say you try to rig a foot, right, so this can be shaped resembling like the foot. Okay, so it can be the left foot or the right foot. Okay, so this will help the animator know which foot they're animating. Okay, but as for now, we're just gonna leave it as circle. Now, the last one is deformer. Okay, so I'm gonna create this cylinder, right? Okay, like that. Now, if you look at this finish rig code can, you notice that there is two objects here. One is bend and the other one is squash. Okay, so we actually utilize this thing called deformer inside Maya. Okay, so make sure this is set to modeling, and you can see the deformer there. Okay, let's do a squash, right? So what it does is it will actually like squash this. Okay, so actually like rigging is just connecting this squash handler or deformer with the controller that we just create, because we don't want the animator to be touching all these unnecessary information. Okay, so what the animator will see is just there is a value for the squash and there is a value for the bending. Okay, so if you put some positive value, it will be like that, and if they put some negative value, it will behave like this. Okay, nothing else should be available for the animator. Okay, just that two value. Okay, and this is what deformer do.